December 31st, 1862 was New Year's Eve. But it was another Eve as well, a far more important Eve to many. It was Freedom's Eve. That night, as the stroke of midnight neared, African Americans across the divided country, both free and enslaved, gathered in homes and churches as they were able, awaiting the news. Would Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation really take effect at midnight? Would enslaved people in the Confederate States really be free? The prayers of these watch night services were, in fact, answered. In the days that followed, daring Union soldiers, many of them black, marched onto plantations across the South reading copies of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States, containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free.
But while it did take effect for some, the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't the smash hit they had been hoping for. It would take almost 3 more years for slavery to actually end in the United States, with the passing of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. And even then, freedom was not immediate for many Black Americans. So, January 1st, 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation. December 6th, 1865, we have the 13th Amendment. So then, what the heck happened on June 19th? Why do we celebrate the end of slavery on June 19th, Juneteenth? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. Yes, I am putting this episode out 2 days early in order for it to go live on June 19th. If you subscribe to my Patreon, you always get episodes on Fridays, but for everyone else, surprise, you're getting this 2 days early. I could not let another Juneteenth pass without getting to the bottom of what exactly that date represents. Because it's not the Emancipation Proclamation and it's not the 13th Amendment, the 2 major slavery-ending acts that people know about. So what happened on June 19th? What does it have to do with freedom? And why did it end up with its own holiday instead of those other dates? Well, to tell this story, we have to go back to 1861. This was a very turbulent year for the United States, to say the least. This was the year that 11 states seceded from the Union, starting with South Carolina in 1860 at the tail end of 1860, and then followed in 1861 in order by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and finally Tennessee. These 11 states became the Confederate States of America. I have had many debates with many people about the reasons for these states leaving the Union and forming their own thing. But really, at the end of the day, regardless of what you want to believe about states' rights or whatever, the main reason they seceded was slavery. Specifically, they worried that the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was a threat to the future of slavery in the South. Now, here's the thing, though. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was not personally a fan of slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist. He wasn't campaigning on the abolition of slavery. In fact, he planned to allow it to continue in the southern states. However, he did want to restrict it in new territories, potential new states that were being explored and settled, and even that was not okay with these southern slave-owning states. They didn't like the idea of any restrictions or government meddling when it came to slavery. And they were actually very vocal about that. They made it very clear that the reason they were leaving the Union was disagreements over the future of slavery. It's in writing in the form of multiple declarations of secession. South Carolina's declaration of secession repeatedly complained that northern states were not enforcing laws that protected slavery. Mississippi's declaration of secession said, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world," end quote. Texas' declaration of secession also defended slavery and emphasized that it should continue as a system. Not to mention, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech from 1861 stated the literal foundation of the Confederacy as resting on the belief that Black people were inferior to white people and that slavery was their, quote, natural condition. So yeah, it was about slavery. Now, one thing I don't think a lot of people realize is that not every slave state left the Union. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri all had slavery, and they chose not to secede. Also, the western part of Virginia wasn't really feeling the whole secession thing either. When Virginia, as a state, seceded in 1861, these western counties broke away from the state and remained on the side of the Union. In 1863, they were officially admitted into the Union as a new state, as the state of West Virginia. So there were technically 5 states with slavery that were still part of the Union. By 1863, the Union and the Confederacy had been embroiled in the Civil War for a couple of years already, and it was a terrible, terrible war. The deadliest war in American history, with as many as 850,000 deaths. American deaths, because every death in the Civil War was an American death. That death toll is higher than the total number of American military deaths from all other U.S. wars before or since combined. Let that sink in for a minute. Lincoln was desperate for a solution. He needed this war to end as soon as possible. Everyone who was dying in this war, these were his people, all of them, right? The Union, the Confederacy, these were all Americans. So his goal was to end this war and to put the country that he was the leader of back together. And for that to happen, he needed the war to end. So initially, it was not at all about ending slavery. That was not the goal of the Union in the Civil War at all. They did not fight the South in order to end slavery in the South. They fought the South to try to stop them from leaving the Union, to put the country back together. Until 1863. Now, that's when the strategy shifted. Lincoln came up with a plan to cripple the South and hopefully expedite a seemingly inevitable Union victory. That plan was the Emancipation Proclamation, ending slavery in the South. Lincoln didn't really write the Emancipation Proclamation because he hated slavery. He did hate it, but that's not why he wrote it. He wrote it because he wanted to hurt the Confederacy, their economy, their military labor force. And I don't think a lot of people realize this either, but the Emancipation Proclamation only freed enslaved people in Confederate-controlled states in active rebellion against the Union. It did not apply to those 5 states in the Union that still had slavery. Those enslaved people were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. It also didn't apply to Confederate states under Union control, which was just Tennessee at that point. Tennessee was under a Union-controlled military government at that time, so it was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation too. So that means that enslaved people in Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, West Virginia, Tennessee, and then also some parts of Louisiana actually were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not universal. Even in the 10 Confederate states where it did apply, it was not instantaneous. It was very hard to enforce for obvious reasons. But as the Union Army sort of gradually took over more and more places throughout the South, they brought the power of the Emancipation Proclamation with them. Many formerly enslaved people fled with the Union Army as it passed through. Many men joined it. And so it wasn't like, when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863 at midnight, all of the enslavers were like, okay, guys, you're free now. You can go. Bye. No, it didn't work like that at all. Freedom came slowly and gradually to some and not at all to others. So you can sort of imagine the Union Army making its way across the South, freeing enslaved people as they went, through Virginia, probably first, down through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, over to Alabama and Mississippi. Where do they come to last? Texas. Texas was on the outskirts of the Confederacy. It was on the edge, right? So there wasn't any large-scale fighting there during the war, no real presence of Union troops at all. So in Texas, all throughout the Civil War, they just kind of carried on, business as usual. So much so that by the end of the war in the spring of 1865, many enslavers from other Confederate states had fled to Texas in order to carry on enslaving and join in their whole business as usual thing they had going on over there. So Texas was like the last holdout where technically the Emancipation Proclamation had freed all enslaved people in Texas, but they were just like, nah, and slavery continued anyway, all through the war and even after the war ended. It was a safe haven for slavery. That would end in June of 1865, June 19th to be exact. So context. The Civil War ended in spring of that year, 1865, with a series of surrenders, most notably Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. It took a couple of months, June, before 2,000 Union forces finally made their way to Galveston, Texas, led by General Gordon Granger. On June 19th, Granger proclaimed that all 250,000 enslaved people in the state of Texas were officially free. Here's what he said.
The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere.
So, he's like, stay here, keep doing what you're doing, just get paid for it now. Which is easier said than done, right? This announcement was met with celebration from many enslaved people in Galveston. But just like the Emancipation Proclamation that already freed all these people once 2 years ago, it was not instantaneous. Many enslavers hid this decree from the people they enslaved until after the harvest season, so they could eke the last few drops out of this whole free labor situation. Even for those who were freed on June 19th in Texas, it's not like their former enslavers just started handing over paychecks, as Granger had suggested. According to Aaron Stewart Malden, professor of Southern history at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and Civil War expert, in an article by Matthew Simitile, quote, plantation owners didn't want to pay their former slaves at all, and the former Confederate States were more or less broke after the war, so they didn't have money to even pay. Though slavery ends, the conditions for many change very little initially, end quote. Even after the 13th Amendment was passed in December of 1865, formally abolishing slavery in all U.S. states, the circumstances of formerly enslaved people were slow to change. These newly freed people, they couldn't just pick up and go live the lives they'd always dreamed of. They had no money. They had no means of going anywhere. So most stayed on the plantations and just fought to get compensated for the labor that they continued to provide. And for many, that was not monetary. Like Professor Malden said, in many cases, the former enslavers did not have the money with which to pay them. But they legally had to compensate them somehow, and so the era of sharecropping began. Matthew Simitile explains in that article, quote, "Laborers would work a plot of land for a share of the crop or profits at the end of the year. Some would begin to amass goods and property, enough to make their own decisions on what to plant, what livestock to buy, and even hire additional laborers to farm the land. But many in this new economic system would amass debt, as the only way to receive property and items to farm was to become indebted to landowners. The struggle for freedom morphed into a struggle for economic independence," end quote. So all that to say that it's important to remember slavery didn't just end one day and newly free Black Americans waltzed into fairy tale lives. For many, not much changed at all, at least not in their lifetimes or even in their children's lifetimes. Professor Malden says, quote, "Freedom was not a straight line from the Emancipation Proclamation to Juneteenth to the Civil Rights Movement. Individuals had to fight for every piece of freedom they experienced, and the struggle for justice that started long before the war did not end with emancipation," end quote. But let's go back to June 19th in Galveston, Texas, to uncover the roots of the now federal holiday of Juneteenth. General Granger reads this decree freeing all of the enslaved people in Texas. And then a year later, 1866, freedmen in Texas organized an annual celebration commemorating that day, June 19th, that would come to be called, originally it was called Jubilee Day. And it was a celebration, so they would have cookouts, they barbecues, right? Music, dancing, parades, and festivals, and families and friends would gather together. They would also have prayer services. And this became a yearly celebration among the Black communities in Texas. Now, as many of these freedmen eventually migrated out of Texas and to other parts of the United States, they brought this Jubilee Day celebration of June 19th with them, and it spread throughout the U.S., at least, pretty much exclusively within the Black communities. It morphed into not just commemorating General Granger's, proclamation in Galveston that day and the freeing of the enslaved people of Texas, but a celebration of freedom in general and the end of slavery in the United States. Eventually, by the late 1800s, the name Juneteenth was coined as a portmanteau, a blend of the words June and 19th. It appeared in newspapers for the first time, I think in 1890. And then in 1979, jumping forward quite a bit here, Juneteenth became an official holiday in Texas. And jumping forward again quite a bit, in 2021, President Joe Biden signed it into law as a federal U.S. holiday, officially Juneteenth National Independence Day, which is hugely significant because honestly, before 2021, it still wasn't really all that known about outside of Black communities. When it became a federal holiday in 2021, suddenly everyone's talking about it, right? Now everyone knows about it as a celebration of freedom, as a celebration of the end of slavery, of emancipation, the end of centuries of oppression. We go hard on the 4th of July. We celebrate the heck out of our country's independence. But that day, July 4th, 1776, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, declaring our independence from Great Britain, our freedom, our unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that didn't apply to everyone. And so in many ways, Juneteenth is more of a celebration of freedom than the 4th of July, because it's a celebration of freedom, finally, for all. And I could get into, women's rights and economic inequality, but, I'm not going to complicate things any further. Juneteenth, in many ways, celebrates the final accomplishment of what July 4th set out and ultimately failed to do. But why Juneteenth? Why not January 1st when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect? Why not December 6th when the 13th Amendment was ratified? Well, simply because no one made holidays for those days. The holiday is Juneteenth because it's the folks down in Texas who decided to make a holiday commemorating the events of that day. And since then, it's grown into a countrywide celebration of freedom. Freedom that didn't come overnight. Freedom that was hard-earned over generations. Professor Malden says, quote, "Juneteenth is neither the beginning nor the end of something. The end of the Civil War and the ending of slavery didn't happen overnight and was a lot more like a jagged edge than a clean cut." She goes on to say, quote, "It is immensely important to remember the difficulties of fighting and securing even the smallest measure of freedom. Juneteenth has become a symbol for emancipation and provides a highly visible celebration that does get at these difficult conversations about America's history." End quote. These difficult conversations. Juneteenth is a celebration, but it's also a sobering reminder of a very dark past. We want holidays to be happy, fun things, right? We want a party. We want hot dogs and fireworks. We don't want to think about sad things. We don't want to think about oppression and injustice. And for far too long, our holidays have been limited to these sort of whitewashed, carefree celebrations of a history that's omitted anything unsavory, everything we wanted to pretend never happened. The 4th of July, Columbus Day. I'm happy to see holidays like Juneteenth and Indigenous Peoples Day finally come on the scene too, because they're important reminders of where we've been and how far we have come. And I can't think of anything more worthy of celebrating than that. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.